when the goal of their case is anti-domestic terrorism, when they didn't tell you why or how an army is suddenly very effective in countering the threat of domestic terrorism in the very first place. Especially when you want to put countries who have support military invasions of Syria and Afghanistan, like France and Germany, in one basket with pacifist countries like Swiss, like Sweden, and like Denmark. It is dangerous for those countries who are not a target of domestic terrorism in the very first place, right? So on their side, because of that increased association, you would increase domestic terrorist attacks in countries in which it wasn't a target in the very first place. I'm going to tell you further how it will be very counterproductive in more physical violent threats towards the EU. And secondly, I'm going to tell you whether this will unite or fracture the EU. I'll extend this debate by talking about how this harms the sovereignty and interests of many EU nations. But firstly, whether this is the most effective way to stop military violence in the EU. One, most of their argument didn't address this. They just claimed the urgency. Oh, what if poor countries are going to be threatened? One, we told you that this creates association to pacifist countries that harms them by making them a target. But two, assuming that what they want is efficacy, I struggle to think how they will work together really effectively, right? Imagine this is a unity of 40 countries with hundreds of languages spread out, and you suddenly want them to make a unitary force that needs to work together all the time. One, there will be a process of integration that takes a very long time. In that very long time, you're going to create a very vulnerable EU that is very weak because countries are still learning to communicate with each other effectively in one unit. But secondly, even when that's true and even when they're already used to it, there's still inefficiencies that happen in between those countries, right? Especially when these are, for example, countries don't speak each other's language. So when you force them to create one unitary language to speak with each other, there are things that will be mistranslated, for example, or there are things that won't be able to be communicated very effectively. That harms the efficacy of each operation that happens. Three, their example of terrorist attacks that they want to prevent is France. So, most likely, you're not talking about the threat of terrorist attacks to poor countries that are in the first place, won't likely be the ones who invaded Afghanistan and Syria and Iraq in the very first place. That proposal just doesn't make sense. But four, usually Islamic terrorism isn't expansionary in the EU like they say, right? Look, in the EU, if it's expansionary, it will literally be dumped down by lots of people because there's no political will in the EU that supports one very conservative Islamic State. That's just ridiculous, right? But then their response is saying, oh, but their concession is a united or cooperative intelligence agency that is also interconnected force that proves our point. So what's the difference? One, notice that the essential difference between police and armies is that police have no power on external exertion of power or no signal on external exertion of power. Therefore, Dita's point on Russian reactions being predicting, for example, what the EU army will do, and they fear the EU army, still stands. Their characterization of Russia being very random in attacking Crimea is a blatant falsifying of facts. Look, Russia attacked Crimea because Ukraine, which is governing Crimea, wanted to become and voted to become the EU in its past year. So it is a reactionary force against the threat of it being combined into the EU. But then they say, oh, then if Russia attacks us, we'll attack them back. Look, that is not exclusive in any way. On our side, they will be still attacked too if they literally attack our homeland, right? The difference is, why do you need to give the signal of it being one combined force that may attack Russia in any way, shape, or form? We don't think that offensive measure is in any way necessary or urgent. That's very dangerous for the safety of the EU. Any point, POS? No. Second, whether this will unite or fracture the EU. Their basic argument is France and Germany both want to kill terrorism, so we both will work together. One, most likely the ones who will not work together are not France and Germany, so that's not the point of the argument. But secondly, look, the ones who will not work together are countries such as France and Germany and Swiss, for example, who are, for example, pacifists, right? Those will create internal conflicts too. Two, They never explain to you how the vote will most likely take place. If they want to talk about the military being contribution of people, most likely the largest militaries will have the votes, right? Like Germany, like France, and not smaller countries that have interest. So you'll get a fracture of interest in that way. But three, look, they don't understand the critical condition of finances in the EU, right? The fact that lots of countries such as Greece, Italy, and Ireland and Spain are still facing economic crisis, and you're asking them to contribute economically to an EU army. Also, there will be still contributions to NATO, also their own army, also in their police. That doesn't make sense at all. How will that create any sort of political unity? Plus, they don't consider the social ramifications and cultural ramifications that happen. Notice that there are anti-EU sentiments, and you make them have sons that will literally be sacrificed for the European Union. That will be more political will to go against the European Union. I'm going to talk about how this harms the sovereignty and interests of EU nations. Look, the good thing about EU having an economic cooperation within the EU is you get the benefits of good business without everyone telling you what to do or to sacrifice your domestic interests. Italy can conduct Mare Nostrum to make sure it has good relations with northern African nations and dead bodies don't wash up on their shores. Ukraine can defend themselves because they know it ain't gonna be a nuclear war when you associate themselves with France. Problem with the EU army is that the conduct of the army won't be proportional to each state's interest. One, like I said, most likely decided by the countries with the largest amount of soldiers or resource production like France and Germany. But secondly, most likely if all votes are equal, you get significant influence and political considerations from these powerful countries that we know identify the same as EU. So if you attack EU, there might be nuclear war, for example, right? Because EU army is also part of the French army, for example. The problem is, at best, you get military operations that harm the interests of smaller countries like Italy because of the trend of anti-immigration, for example. You ignore votes of immigrants that may harm trade relations from Italy with northern African countries. But at worst, you render armies ineffective in responding to threats because there's this association and you fear fiercer responses like nuclear war between France and Russia, or you just don't go to conflict because big northern European countries who rely on Russian oil doesn't want to go to conflict. We're very proud to oppose.